The call came right in the middle of a polite laugh. The kind of laugh you offer when you are a widow at a charity luncheon. And someone tells a story about a husband who is still alive. The clinking of crystal goblets and the soft hum of string music in the ballroom felt like a thick blanket wrapped around the room, insulating everyone from the jagged edges of real life. My phone vibrated in my clutch, a sudden, jarring rhythm against the silk lining. I ignored it at first. Grief teaches you to compartmentalize, to smile while your chest aches, to let the world believe you have finally found your footing on ground that is still secretly shifting beneath your shoes. But it vibrated again, and then a third time, insistent and sharp. I excused myself from the table, smoothing the skirt of my dress, and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted corridor of the hotel. I pulled the phone out and saw the name of the master electrician I had hired earlier that week. Marcus. He was supposed to be rewiring the antique chandelier and the outdated fuse box down in Arthur's basement workshop. It was a project I had put off for a year, largely because opening the door to that workshop felt like opening a tomb. I answered with that practiced, measured politeness that becomes a second language when you are navigating life alone. Marcus, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the empty hallway. Is there a problem with the breaker, Mrs. Hayes? He said. And the moment the words left his mouth, the temperature in my veins seemed to drop. His voice wasn't just professional. It was tight, breathless, carrying the careful weight of a man who had stumbled into a room he wasn't supposed to enter. You need to come home. Right now. I stopped walking. The faint sound of the luncheon behind the heavy oak doors suddenly felt miles away. If it's an issue with the wiring, Marcus, you can shut off the main. It's not the wiring, ma'am, he cut in, respectful but unyielding. His voice dropped to a near whisper, as if my own basement might be listening to him. I was running the new conduit near the back wall, behind the old tool pegboards. I found a false ceiling panel. It was rigged to look like a ventilation return, but the drywall gave way when I shifted my ladder. He paused, and I heard the sound of him exhaling a shaky breath. There's a heavy metal lockbox up here. Hidden. And there's an envelope taped to the top of it. It has your name on it. He left it for you. But, Mrs. Hayes, you need to come alone. The corridor tilted. It wasn't a dramatic swoon, just a slow, sickening slide of reality, rearranging itself without my permission. I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't tell him I was in the middle of an event. The word alone sat between us like a heavy stone dropped into still water. Grief makes you fiercely protective of the quiet, but it also makes you terrified of secrets. Because secrets mean the person you buried wasn't exactly the person you knew. I'm on my way, I said. My voice didn't shake. My hand didn't tremble when I ended the call. My body did what it had done since the morning Arthur's heart stopped beating in his sleep. It went into a state of quiet, absolute endurance. I didn't go back into the ballroom to say my goodbyes. I didn't find my coat check ticket. I walked straight out the front doors of the venue, handed the valet my ticket, and stood in the crisp afternoon air, staring at the manicured hedges without seeing them. If you are watching this right now, tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me, because I remember the exact angle of the sun hitting my windshield as I drove away. And I want to know where you are in the world, while I tell you how it feels to realize your marriage was fighting a war you didn't even know you were drafted into. The drive home was a blur of gray asphalt and red taillights. My mind raced backward, sorting through the last year of my life. After Arthur passed, his older brother, Richard, had stepped in to manage things. Richard was the patriarch of the family business, a mid-sized manufacturing firm that Arthur had poured his sweat and brilliance into for 30 years. Richard was a man who wore expensive suits and spoke with the smooth, condescending authority of someone who believed the world existed to serve his comfort. He had draped his arm around my shoulders at the funeral, his voice dripping with practiced sorrow, telling me, Don't you worry your pretty head about the business, Helen. You're too fragile right now. I'll take care of Arthur's share. You just rest. I had let him. That was my sin. I had been so submerged in the agonizing ocean of losing my husband that I mistook Richard's control for care. I let him handle the dividends, the accounts. The sudden, confusing influx of legal paperwork that always seemed to require my signature on lines I was too exhausted to read. Every Sunday, he would invite me to his sprawling home for dinner, pouring me wine, and gently suggesting that this large house of mine was too much for a widow to manage, hinting that I should move to a condo and sign over my power of attorney so I wouldn't be burdened. I thought he was trying to protect me from stress. I drove past my neighborhood gates, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, realizing that protection and prison look exactly the same if you don't check the locks. When I pulled into my driveway, Marcus's white utility van was parked near the garage. I walked through my front door, the silence of the house pressing against my eardrums. I went straight to the basement door and descended the wooden stairs. The smell of Arthur's workshop hit me with the force of a physical blow. It smelled of motor oil, old coffee, cedar sawdust, and the sharp tang of metal shavings. It smelled like him. Marcus was standing near the workbench, wiping his hands nervously on a rag. He looked at me, his eyes wide and sympathetic, then gestured toward the far corner of the room. A heavy, dark gray metal lockbox sat on Arthur's scarred wooden workbench. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, except for the top, where Marcus had wiped it away to reveal a sealed, manila envelope taped securely to the metal. My name was written across it in Arthur's sharp, unmistakable cursive. "I didn't open it, ma'am," Marcus said softly, stepping back toward the stairs. "I didn't touch anything else. I'll go sit in my van. Take all the time you need." "Thank you, Marcus," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly small in the cavernous basement. When the heavy basement door clicked shut upstairs, I was left alone with the ghost. I walked slowly toward the workbench, my heels clicking against the concrete floor. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the rough texture of the envelope. I peeled the tape back. The sound was loud, tearing through the quiet. Inside was a small brass key and a folded sheaf of thick, cream-colored paper. I set the key down and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat, steady. The ink pressed firmly into the page as if he had written it with a clenched jaw. "My dearest Helen," the letter began, and my throat instantly closed tight. "If you are reading this, then my heart finally gave out. And I have left you alone in a house that I hope still feels like home. I am writing this to you from the shadows, because if I brought this into the light while I was alive, it would have destroyed your peace, and your peace was the only thing I ever truly wanted to protect." I pulled out the stool Arthur used to sit on while he tinkered with old radios and lowered myself onto it. The leather was worn perfectly to shape. I kept reading, my eyes scanning the words as the reality of my husband's silent suffering began to unfold in front of me. "Richard is not who he pretends to be," Arthur wrote. The bluntness of the sentence made me gasp. "For the last 5 years, he has been systematically siphoning funds from the manufacturing firm's reserves. He has been hiding the losses through a series of ghost vendors and inflated material costs. When I confronted him 3 years ago, he didn't apologize. He threatened me. He told me that if I went to the authorities, he would drag the company into a scandalous bankruptcy that would wipe out our retirement, our home, and leave you with absolutely nothing." My hands began to shake. The paper rattled softly in the quiet basement. I pictured Richard at the Sunday dinners, smiling over his wine glass, praising Arthur's hard work while secretly bleeding him dry. "I knew my health was failing, Helen," the letter continued. "I knew I didn't have the stamina for a 10-year legal war that would consume the end of my life and drag you through the mud of public litigation. But I also knew that the moment I died, Richard would move to take everything from you. He views your kindness as weakness. He will try to convince you that you are incompetent. He will surround you with his lawyers, his accountants, his false sympathy. He will try to force you out of this house and strip you of your rightful shares by declaring you too fragile to manage your own affairs. I stared at the wall, remembering every single time Richard had patted my hand and told me I was too delicate for business talk. Every time he suggested a manageable condo. It wasn't concern. It was a calculated, long-term campaign to quietly strip me of my agency. He was cultivating my helplessness so he could harvest my estate. But I did not leave you defenseless. Arthur's handwriting grew larger, bolder, as if he were shouting the words onto the page. Inside this box are audio cassette tapes of Richard admitting to the fraud during our private arguments. I recorded him. I also secured a secondary, private ledger detailing every stolen dollar, every fake vendor, every offshore transfer. But more importantly, Helen, I spent the last 2 years secretly working with a trust attorney outside of Richard's sphere of influence, a man named David Sterling. His card is in the box. I swallowed hard, feeling a sudden, terrifying surge of power rising in my chest, replacing the suffocating grief that had lived there for a year. I restructured my entire ownership of the firm into a blind, ironclad trust that triggered the moment my death certificate was signed. Richard thinks he has control because he is the managing partner. But he does not know that my shares and the controlling interest in the commercial real estate the factories sit on were irrevocably transferred to you. You hold the land. You hold the debt. You hold the power. The letter ended with a final paragraph that shattered whatever was left of the quiet, grieving widow I had been an hour ago. Helen, do not let him see you cry. Do not let him think he has won. Take this box to Sterling. Execute the trust. Richard believes you are a pawn, but I have spent my last years turning you into the queen. Take the board. I love you now and always. Arthur. I sat perfectly still for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. The basement didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like an armory. I picked up the small brass key, inserted it into the heavy lock on the metal box, and turned it. The mechanism clicked with a satisfying, heavy thud. I lifted the lid. Inside, stacked with meticulous care, were 3 audio cassettes, a thick, black leather-bound ledger, and a crisp, white business card with the name David Sterling, ESQ printed in elegant, embossed lettering. I didn't cry. I didn't wail or collapse onto the floor. The tears that had been lingering behind my eyes for a year evaporated, burned away by a cold, righteous fury. Arthur had carried this immense, terrifying burden entirely alone, smiling at the dinner table, kissing my forehead, holding my hand, all while fighting a shadow war against his own brother, just to ensure I would have a roof over my head when he was gone. He had endured Richard's arrogance, Richard's theft, and Richard's threats, swallowing his own pride so that I wouldn't have to carry his anxiety. I reached into the box and lifted the heavy black ledger. Its weight felt profound in my hands. It was the weight of truth. I thought about the charity luncheon I had just left. I thought about the women complaining about caterers and floral arrangements. I thought about how trivial the world seemed when you realized that monsters don't hide under the bed. They sit at the head of your dining table and offer to pour you more Chardonnay. I closed the lockbox, tucked the letter inside, and carried it upstairs. I found Marcus sitting in his van, reading a newspaper. I knocked on his window. He rolled it down, his eyes searching my face for signs of a breakdown. He found none. "Marcus," I said, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of the tremor I had woken up with that morning. "The wiring in the basement can wait. I have a bonus for you for your discretion today. And I need you to forget you ever saw that panel." "I don't know what panel you're talking about, Mrs. Hayes." Marcus said immediately, giving me a solemn nod. I watched him drive away, the taillights fading down the street. I walked back into my house and locked the door. The silence in the foyer was no longer heavy. It was expectant. I walked to the hall mirror and looked at my reflection. My hair was perfectly styled. My silk dress was unwrinkled. My makeup was flawless. I looked exactly like the fragile, wealthy widow Richard needed me to be. I practiced a small, wavering smile. It looked pathetic. It looked convincing. Sunday was 3 days away. The traditional family dinner. I knew exactly how it would go. Richard would carve the roast. He would ask me how I was coping. He would look at me with pity and slide a brochure for a luxury condominium across the mahogany table. And for the very first time since Arthur died, I wasn't going to politely deflect. I was going to agree with him. I was going to give him enough rope to hang himself while I spent the week building the gallows. I pulled David Sterling's business card from my pocket, walked into my kitchen, and dialed the number. A receptionist answered immediately. Sterling Law Group, how may I direct your call? I need to speak to Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice ringing with a new dark authority. Tell him Helen Hayes is calling. And tell him it is time to open the vault. There was a brief pause, a rustle of paper, and then a deep, calm voice came on the line. Mrs. Hayes, I have been waiting for your call for a year. I trust you found what Arthur left you. I found it, I said, staring out the kitchen window at the manicured lawn. And I am ready to use it. Then we have work to do, Sterling replied. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 8. Bring the ledger. I hung up the phone and stood in the center of my kitchen. I didn't feel like a victim. I didn't feel like a grieving widow. I felt like a storm that had just made landfall. Richard thought he had buried his brother's secrets when he buried Arthur. He didn't realize that Arthur hadn't buried secrets. He had planted seeds. And now the harvest was coming. The scent of rosemary and roasted lamb filled Richard's massive, ostentatious dining room. The Sunday dinner was a ritual designed entirely around his ego. The long mahogany table was set with heavy silver and fine china. An audience of extended family members arranged neatly to watch him perform the role of the benevolent patriarch. I sat near his right hand, wearing a soft, gray cardigan that made me look slightly washed out, playing the part of the fading widow with an Oscar-worthy dedication. Richard held court, swirling a glass of expensive Bordeaux, his booming voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He complained about the burdens of leadership, the stress of managing Arthur's messy legacy at the firm, ensuring that everyone at the table understood what a martyr he was for carrying the family on his back. I chewed my lamb slowly, keeping my eyes cast down, letting the anger simmer in my chest until it reduced into something sharp and pure. Helen, dear, Richard said suddenly, his voice dripping with that sickening, practiced warmth. The table fell silent. All eyes turned to me. I drove past Arthur's house yesterday. The lawn is looking a bit overgrown. I worry about you out there all alone in that massive place. The maintenance, the stairs. It's just too much for someone in your delicate state. I looked up, letting my eyes widen slightly, projecting a vulnerability that made me want to gag. It is a lot of house, Richard. Some days, the quiet is just overwhelming. Richard smiled, a slow, predatory stretching of his lips. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and withdrew a glossy, trifold brochure. He slid it across the polished wood toward my plate. I took the liberty of looking into the Oakwood Towers. Luxury condominiums. Concierge service. Zero maintenance. It would be perfect for you. And to ease your burden, I've had my attorney draft a simple power of attorney document. You sign it, and I'll handle the sale of Arthur's house, manage your dividends from the firm. And you won't ever have to look at another stressful piece of paperwork again. You can just rest. The silence at the table was suffocating. His wife, a woman who had mastered the art of looking the other way, offered me a tight, encouraging smile. A nephew across the table nodded solemnly, as if Richard were offering me a life raft instead of a set of handcuffs. I stared at the brochure. It wasn't an offer of help. It was a formal declaration of his final move. He wanted my house. He wanted legal control of my assets. He wanted to lock me in a gilded cage while he devoured the keys. I reached out with a trembling hand, a physical exertion that took effort to fake, and touched the brochure. "You are always so thoughtful, Richard," I murmured, my voice soft and breathless. I will look at this. I think I am finally ready to let you take the reins." The triumph that flashed in Richard's eyes was so bright it was practically radioactive. He leaned back in his chair, raising his wine glass in a magnanimous toast. "To family," he declared. "We protect our own." "To family," I echoed softly, lifting my water glass. I took a sip to hide the cold, merciless smile that fought to break across my face. The next 5 days were a masterclass in silent warfare, while Richard basked in the glow of his impending victory, assuming I was sitting in my living room weeping over packing boxes. I was sitting in the sleek, minimalist boardroom of David Sterling's law firm downtown. Sterling was a brilliant, quiet man who understood that true power never needs to shout. He had reviewed the heavy black ledger, listening to the audio cassettes on a secure player, his face remaining entirely impassive. As Richard's recorded voice bragged about funneling corporate funds into shell companies. "Arthur was a genius," Sterling said quietly, closing the ledger. He knew Richard controlled the board of directors. He knew Richard controlled the accountants. But Richard never checked the foundational deeds to the industrial parks where the manufacturing plants operate. Arthur quietly transferred sole ownership of the land holding company into this blind trust 3 years ago. "The firm doesn't own the ground it sits on, Helen. You do." I looked at the thick stack of legal documents Sterling had prepared. "So, what happens when I execute this trust today?" Sterling adjusted his glasses. "The blind trust becomes active. The corporate veil is pierced. Richard's authority over the firm's operating accounts is immediately subordinated to the trust's oversight committee, which is solely controlled by you. Every check he tries to write, every vendor he tries to pay, will require your direct authorization. Furthermore, the trust immediately calls in the overdue rent on the factories, rent that Arthur intentionally deferred for 3 years to build an unpayable debt." "And the fraud?" I asked, tapping the cover of the black ledger. "The fraud is the kill shot," Sterling replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "We have prepared a forensic audit package based on this ledger. The moment Richard tries to fight the trust execution, we hand this package to the federal authorities. He won't just lose the company, Helen. He will go to federal prison." I picked up the heavy gold pen sitting on Sterling's desk. I didn't hesitate. I didn't tremble. I signed my name on the execution order with sharp, definitive strokes, feeling the ghost of my husband standing right behind my chair, guiding my hand. "File it," I said, setting the pen down. "Let the locks click shut." The fallout wasn't immediate. Financial executions take a day or 2 to filter down through the banking networks. I spent Wednesday and Thursday quietly moving Arthur's personal items into storage, ensuring the house was pristine and waiting for the bomb to detonate. It happened on Friday morning. My phone rang at 10 a.m. It wasn't Richard. It was his secretary, a woman whose voice usually carried an air of bored superiority, but who currently sounded like she was hyperventilating. "Mrs. Hayes," she stammered. "Mr. Bennett has requested." "Well, he's demanded an emergency family meeting. Tonight, at the main conference room at the firm. He said it is a matter of absolute urgency regarding Arthur's estate." "I will be there," I said calmly, and hung up. The trap had snapped. He had tried to move funds, and the bank had slammed the door in his face. He was panicked. He was cornered. And like any narcissist who feels control slipping, he was going to try and bully me into submission in front of an audience. When I arrived at the firm's headquarters that evening, the sky was bruised with dark, gathering storm clouds. I wore a tailored black suit that I hadn't touched since the funeral. I wore Arthur's favorite pearls. I didn't look like a fading widow. I looked like a CEO arriving for a hostile takeover. I walked into the massive glass-walled conference room. The entire inner circle of the family was there. Richard was pacing at the head of the table, his face flushed. His tie loosened, sweating profusely. Sitting next to him was a slick, aggressive-looking corporate attorney, with a briefcase open in front of him. The rest of the family members looked anxious, whispering among themselves, staring at me as if I were a stranger who had just wandered into the wrong building. "Helen," Richard barked as soon as the door clicked shut behind me. He didn't offer me a seat. He didn't offer a polite greeting. The facade of the benevolent patriarch had burned to the ground. "What the hell is going on?" My CFO just called me. "The operating accounts are frozen. The bank is telling me that some ghost trust executed a lock on the entire corporate structure, and that you are the sole beneficiary. What game are you playing?" I walked slowly toward the opposite end of the long table. I placed my designer handbag on the polished wood. I didn't sit down. I stood tall, meeting his frantic, enraged gaze with eyes as cold as absolute zero. "I am not playing a game, Richard," I said, my voice carrying cleanly across the silent room. "I am simply taking inventory of my property." The slick attorney stood up, pointing a pen at me. "Mrs. Hayes, whatever fraudulent paperwork you filed this week is null and void." Arthur was mentally compromised in his final months. "We have already prepared a motion to contest this trust, based on your husband's diminished capacity. And we will be filing an injunction to have you declared financially incompetent due to extreme grief. You need to sign these reversal documents right now, or we will tie you up in litigation until you lose your house." It was exactly what Arthur had predicted. The threat of litigation, the attack on my competence, the weaponization of my grief. I reached into my handbag. I didn't pull out the reversal documents. I pulled out the heavy, black leather ledger. I dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table. The thud was loud enough to make the slick attorney flinch. "Before you file motions regarding my competence, counselor," I said, leaning forward, resting my fingertips on the wood, "you might want to review the competence of your client." Richard stared at the black ledger. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting under heat. He knew exactly what it was. He recognized Arthur's binding. "What is that?" Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "That," I said, turning my gaze to the rest of the shocked family members sitting around the table, "is a detailed, forensic accounting of every dollar Richard has embezzled from this company over the last 5 years. It details the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. It details the inflated vendor invoices. It details the theft of Arthur's legacy." The room erupted into gasps. Richard's wife covered her mouth. The nephew who had nodded along at Sunday dinner stared at Richard in horror. "That's a forgery," Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table, spit flying from his lips. "Arthur was crazy. He made it up to ruin me. You have no proof." I reached into my bag a second time. I pulled out a small, portable digital recorder where Sterling had digitized the audio cassettes. I pressed play and set it next to the ledger. The room filled with the unmistakable, arrogant voice of Richard. "Recorded years ago in the basement workshop. You think I care about the margins, Arthur? I run this board. If you breathe a word to the feds about the offshore accounts, I will sink this entire company. I'll leverage the debt against your house. I'll leave Helen begging on the street. You're a dying man, brother. Take your pills and shut your mouth." I pressed stop. The silence in the conference room was so profound it felt like the air had been vacuumed out. The slick attorney slowly sat down, closing his briefcase with a quiet click. He recognized a losing battle when he heard one. He was hired to bully a widow. He wasn't hired to act as an accessory to federal fraud. Richard looked around the table, his chest heaving, searching for an ally. He found none. The family he had controlled with his money and his arrogance was looking at him with disgust and fear. The patriarch had been unmasked as a parasite. I walked around the table until I was standing directly across from him. He looked small. He looked pathetic. "Arthur knew exactly who you were, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper. "He spent his last dying years swallowing your insults and suffering your arrogance, all while building a cage so ironclad that the moment he was gone, you would lock yourself inside it." "Helen, please," Richard whimpered, his hands shaking as he reached out toward me. The bully had vanished, replaced by a coward facing ruin. "We're family. Don't go to the authorities. We can make a deal. I'll step down. I'll give you my shares. Just don't send me to prison." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity. No residual familial affection. I thought about the Sunday dinners. I thought about the condo brochure. I thought about him telling me I was too fragile to manage my own life. "Here is the deal you are going to take, Richard," I said, turning to look at his attorney. "Tomorrow morning, you will sign over your remaining equity in this firm to the trust. You will resign your position as managing director, effective immediately. You will vacate your office by midnight tonight. If you agree to these terms, and if you quietly disappear into retirement, I will lock this ledger in a vault. If you attempt to contact me, if you attempt to access a single corporate account, or if you ever suggest to anyone in this city that I am incompetent, I will hand this audio recording to the FBI before you can finish your sentence." Richard swallowed, a tear of absolute humiliation sliding down his cheek. He nodded, a jerky, broken movement. Okay, Helen. I resign." "Good," I said. I picked up my handbag, leaving the ledger and the recorder on the table for the attorney to stare at. I turned to the rest of the family, who were sitting in stunned, terrified silence. If anyone else has concerns about my ability to manage this estate, now is the time to voice them. No one spoke. No one breathed. I walked out of the conference room, the click of my heels echoing down the long, glass hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The empire had fallen, and it had been conquered by a ghost and a grieving woman who refused to shrink. The cleanup took several months. Sterling was meticulous. Richard was excised from the corporate structure like a tumor. The shell companies were dismantled, the stolen funds slowly repatriated into the firm's legitimate accounts. Richard and his wife moved out of their sprawling mansion, retreating to a quiet, obscure town out of state, stripped of their power and their social standing. The family never spoke of him again. They treated me with a new, profound reverence. Not out of love, perhaps, but out of a healthy, permanent respect for the boundary I had drawn in fire. As for me, I didn't move into a luxury condo. I stayed in the house Arthur and I had built. I walked down to the basement workshop one final time. I cleaned the dust from his workbench. I oiled his tools. I didn't pack them away. I left them exactly as they were, a monument to a man who had fought a silent, agonizing war, to ensure I would never have to surrender. With the recovered funds from Richard's embezzlement, I didn't buy jewelry or take luxury cruises. I worked with the new board of directors at the firm to establish a fully funded, state-of-the-art trade school for young mechanics and engineers, right in the heart of the city. I named it the Arthur Hayes Institute. I wanted his name spoken with respect, attached to a legacy of building things up, rather than tearing people down. On the day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony, I stood on the podium, looking out at the crowd of students, local leaders, and community members. I didn't feel like a fragile widow. I felt rooted, solid, and fiercely alive. The sun was shining, warm and bright. And as I cut the ribbon, I felt a familiar, comforting presence standing right beside me. People think that true love is loud. They think it's grand gestures and public declarations, but it isn't. True love is the quiet, exhausting work of building a fortress around the person you cherish, even if it means you have to stand in the dark to do it. Arthur had stood in the dark for me, and now, because of him, I get to stand in the light.